Hello, Eric Walczykowski here, host of Tailored Talent and CEO of Bespoke Partners. Today, I'm joined by Patrick Dennis, the CEO of Avaya. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Now that we've got kind of how we look at governance, where we're going to help with the outside thinking or subject matter expertise, one of the things you mentioned was selecting the management team, CEO, final authority, but there's certain roles that board input is going to be important. Talk to me about, I've got my value creation plan. I've gone through the financial aspects, the operational, I've set the governance. So now I've got to look at my executive leadership team and align them to value creation. Talk to me a little bit about how you assess, and then you go in and go, okay, these are the changes I need to make. How am I going to go about making those changes?
Probably I'm sure, having done a bunch of these, you get a lot of the same answers. Many of us have like some of the same ways we do it. So I'll try to maybe focus on the thing that I think I do differently. I'm very sensitive to the season the company is in. And sometimes they don't last long. And that might sound funny because, folks like to think you hire executives and that they're going to last the entire hold period. That is not my experience. Sometimes you have to hire an executive who is going to spike in a particular area of competency and bang out that part of the value creation plan. And you might have to accept that when they're done doing that part, they might not be the right executive for the following season of value creation. And because speed and time matter so much and the margin of error is narrow, I am much more likely to hire situational executives than some folks, understanding that that might be a journey to what is a destination executive team that is going to go into a run mode. And so I do think for many of these situations, there is sort of like this special forces executive unit that gets dropped in at the beginning. There's a body of work that has to get done. By the time you're turning that over into a run phase, that could look like a very different group. Now, by the way, it tends to be when there's those big changes, that tends to be when there's, a transaction that happens anyway, and sort of the next leg of the race starts. But probably the thing that I do that is different from many of my peers is I'm acutely aware of the season that I'm in, and I hire to the season.
Makes a ton of sense. Well, so when you think about, you mentioned a couple areas around pricing and go-to-market motion. How do you approach those roles, and how quickly do you make changes in those situations? Because we notice actually go-to-market turns over the most in all private equity deals that we do, just because of the, I guess, the importance of growth in all these deals.
Yeah, so it's funny. I've turned that role over a bunch, and it's not just the role. So that happens to be a place where I do encourage people to get some outside in help and make sure there's a real diagnostic done, certainly before you go and change an executive. And that tends to be because after that executive changes, they're going to change the next layer. That's going to change the next layer. So you could be a year into one of those before you ultimately field the squad.
Yep.
A year is a long time. Okay. I'd also argue oftentimes more value is created in the first year than in the last year of the hold. So you're trying to prove a run in the out years, whereas you're trying to, get the build done in the early years. So I think I think that is a position that is not thought enough about. Oddly enough, I think the hardest search for software is CFOs. And so I think a lot of times people think really hard about doing that because it's a hard search. I think the most impactful search is the CRO search. And if we tend to use a lot of sports analogies in go-to-market. So I think all of a sudden we got very used to having CROs be like quarterbacks, and like we start to swap them out. And I think you have to be really a lot more thoughtful about that and really consider whether or not you can wrap other talent around that individual to get the desired results versus simply go to that individual and say, I'm going to get a better version. What I'm sure you've seen is by the time you get to these really exceptional roles and people have a track record, yes, there are exceptional people and there are people that are less exceptional, but that delta can be much more narrow at this level than I think people realize. And you can pretty quickly get yourself into a full year of rebuild, which is both expensive in time and cost, when perhaps you would have been better off augmenting the team.
Well, and yeah, we've done significant analysis on the cost of the CRO and not having CRO in place, and that's actually the most expensive role in the organization,
without question.
And you mentioned a year. Well, that's 20 to 25% of your hold period. So the clock is ticking. If you've got to recommend that, I mean, you're out. So let's talk a little bit about quickly.
Well, and let's just pause on that for a second, which means one of two things. You either have to pull down your return expectations, which is the single most expensive thing you can do.
For sure.
Right. Or you have to unnaturally augment the back end growth to get back to that exit expectation, which, like, when you start to talk about the big numbers, might just not, like, physics might not let that happen.
Oh, absolutely. In a day today where you're saying you've got to have higher growth rates to generate the return thesis for private equity firms, which is, as you said, it's very expensive. When you talk about the CRO and that being the most valuable role, what are you looking for in that particular instance? How do you prevent we like to call it the big hat, no cattle trick that a lot of these salespeople can do, is they show up well, but they don't have the goods?
That one's hard. I'm going to probably answer this in a really strange way. Get your revenue ops team in before you get your CRO. And the reason I say that is the measurement system shouldn't be run by the person being measured. So I like a strong rev ops function. I like it to turn out to be the source of truth. It should sit in between the sales organization and finance. It doesn't live in either of those places. I've had it report to me before. That might be overkill, but you can find a more neutral ground for it to report to. And what that does for you is it gives you better telemetry. Now let me try to answer your question. Like, what do I actually want in a CRO? And nobody ever tells the truth about this. I want consistency. I want forecast accuracy and consistency and transparency. All right. And growth. Now, most people will start with, I want the growth. All right. But as a person that's exited a lot of companies, inconsistent results that are still growing are not worth as much as consistent results that demonstrate growth. And I'm not really into the hand wavy thing. If we missed a quarter or made a quarter on the back of the one deal at Acme Corp, like, let's just be honest about that and then recalibrate the following quarter if it pushed, or understand the following quarter might be off by the same value as the Acme Corp deal because we pulled it forward. So I think sometimes what happens in that job is, over the years, and unfortunately, I think you and I are probably both old enough to have watched this, the best salesperson got promoted 1,000 times over, and now they're the CRO. And in today's CRO, as it relates to a value creation playbook and as it relates to exiting, needs a level of business acumen that probably was not required, when I was a sales rep a million years ago. What am I really looking for? I'm looking for some consistency. That forecast accuracy is important. And I think one way, the reason what sparked the RevOps comment was your all hat, no cattle. You can get tricked. So at least if you're going to make a mistake, know you made it fast. I think the way to do that is you need telemetry that's better. And by the way, you need it for your exit anyway. So I think the RevOps function is oftentimes overlooked as being a pretty critical component to a successful CRO.
No, that's fantastic. One last question on the CFO, hardest role to fill. And look, I mean, from my perspective, one of the things we see over and over again is, whereas CROs show up really well in the interview, sometimes CFOs don't show up very well because of their analytical nature. And I think really getting behind is this the person that can implement the KPIs that are going to drive us to success? Talk to me about why that's such a hard role to fill.
Well, when you invite me to do these things, I'm going to give you the truth. Nobody likes to talk about this, but if you graduate with a degree in software engineering, you should go write software for a software company, not go into IT. Yep. If you graduate with a degree in finance, one might argue you should go work for a bank or a private equity firm or work on that side of the ledger. And that the equivalent of the software engineer going to IT is the equivalent of a finance person going to work for a company in finance versus go into finance as a discipline. And so I do think there's this natural tension that I've observed, by the way, in every single CEO role I've had. So this is to say nothing of the firms, that some of the smartest people in high finance are going to be the people that bought the company, and they are going to interface with somebody that made a decision to go into an internal finance role. Not dissimilar to when you meet lawyers and there is that schism between people that are outside counsel and inside counsel. And so I just think there is a built-in tension and expectation there that is a little unusual and has to be navigated. You can go hit the override button if you're the CEO on that. I wouldn't do it. You've got to find a CFO that is going to work with and resonate with the sponsor. And if you don't, then you are going to spend all your time dealing with that friction. So
it's going to take you out of vision, strategy, culture, because you're going to be dealing with numbers.
Yeah, why we can't agree on what the monthly pack looks like. And, so that's a role. It's a hard hire. It's a hard hire because I do think that there's some of these built-in expectations and friction that goes back and forth. That is a time where, picking a good talent partner is important because they'll help you. What I think you folks do an exceptional job of when you're at your best is you do figure out how to do some of that matching on all of our behalf. Because you get to see the client, you get to see the candidate in sort of a raw way. That CFO role is hard because of that.
For sure. Genuinely appreciate you coming on the show and giving a little insight into how you build value creation, build a board, and then look at your ELT. So I appreciate you coming on and hope you have an amazing day.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate you having me.